الله بالخير. لعل الدعوة إلى إجراء تحقيق برلماني في اتفاقية أوكس للغواصات التي تعمل بالطاقة النووية هي مستند وقعت عليه مجموعة من السياسيين البارزين والقادة العسكريين السابقين والخبراء الأكاديميين الأستراليين، على خلفية أن الاتفاقية الأمنية الثلاثية بين أستراليا وبريطانيا وأمريكا ليست سوى جزء من استراتيجية المحيطين الهندي والهادئ التي وضعتها الولايات المتحدة لاحتواء الصين والحفاظ على هيمنتها الإقليمية والعالمية. ما سر خضوع أستراليا للنزعة العسكرية الأمريكية؟ كيف تتعامل الدبلوماسية الأسترالية مع العواقب الجيوسياسية لاتفاق الغواصات في جنوب شرق آسيا والمحيط الهادئ؟ في ظل التوترات الجيوسياسية المتصاعدة مع الصين، هل ستتمكن أستراليا من تحييد نفسها عن لهيب أي حرب أمريكية مستقبلية في المنطقة؟ ولماذا يصر الوزراء الأستراليون على الحديث عن سيادة أستراليا واستقلاليتها في ظل تحولها المضطرد إلى قاعدة للعمليات الأمريكية الهجومية على آسيا وحتى أفريقيا؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر من ضيفنا ديفيد ماكبرايد، المبلغ عن جرائم حرب اقترفتها القوات الخاصة الأسترالية في أفغانستان في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب صفار، خليكم ويانا. David McBride, Australian war crimes whistleblower, former British Army major, former Australian Army lawyer. David, salam and welcome to Al Mayadeen. This is the Proximate Aspect. I'm Zainab Al-Safa. Pure pleasure to have you always, David.
Salam, Zaina. I'm honored to be on your show again.
Most welcome. Well, David, the Australian government has announced a 4-decade-long deal to acquire American and British nuclear-powered submarines, or AUKUS, which was signed in 2021. The deal undermines global and regional arms control regimes, such as the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, and the Treaty on the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, thus threatening global and regional stability. Did Australia adopt a strategy of projecting force well beyond its borders, in this case, into the South China Sea, thus unsettling China?
Yes, it is a very poor decision. It definitely gives China the feeling that they are under siege. China was our biggest trading partner, it probably still is. So it makes no sense for Australia to antagonize China simply at the behest of the United States. It was only about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5, when Chinese naval ships were allowed in Sydney Harbour. And the Americans under Mike Pompeo seem to not like that, and they have been pushing it. There is nothing in it for Australia's benefit. A bit like the war in Afghanistan, I don't believe we're in it because we seriously believe China is the problem.
Hmm.
We're in it because we just want to uh, make ourselves indispensable to the United States
Hmm.
with the mistaken idea that if we help the United States, they will benefit us with trade deals or something. I think it's very short-sighted,
Hmm.
and a lot of senior statesmen who are not aligned with any political party anymore and are now free to speak have said things like it is the worst deal in history.
Right. We will come to detail more on this particular details. But during the Cold War, to counter the threats from the Soviet Union, the US proposed the building of a multilateral nuclear force under NATO's command. Today, under the AUKUS agreement, Australia will be able to build nuclear-powered submarines with technology provided by the US and the UK, of course. It marks a shift of the US deterrence strategy in the region. That is a combination of conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. Does this, David, reveal the US intention to reactivate its nuclear assets inherited from the Cold War era?
Yes, I believe it's directly linked. One thing the Cold War was good for
Mhm.
in America was it was good for business. And if you were in the business of making submarines or tanks or B 52s or bombs, you did very nicely.
Mhm.
Those corporations are very, very powerful in Washington. They make the decisions, and people like Joe Biden rubber stamp the decisions made by corporations, just as the oil companies make decisions in relation to oil,
Mhm. Mhm.
not the US government. Now, that's because the donations, the political money donations are so huge, the politicians can't say no to them. It was sold to Australia that we would be building our own nuclear submarines, but that
Mhm.
was just the salesman's line. It turns out we're not building anything in Australia, maybe some minor parts, but everything has been built in the US. We're
Mhm.
getting second-hand submarines from the US. We're just paying the bill. In fact, one rather arrogant United Kingdom politician, in trying to sell the deal to his electorate, said, "This is the best deal ever for Britain because Australia is paying for everything."
Allow me to ask you here, the AUKUS agreement has left Australia, as you said, more deeply entangled with US strategic priorities and war preparations than ever before. In the context of our reference, a call for parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal, as you said also, and as we indicated before, a range of high-profile politicians, former military leaders and academic experts have signed the call for a parliamentary inquiry into the AUKUS deal. As a matter of urgency, what are the MPT implications of this deal? And we all know that Australia is a signatory of the MPT.
Yes, well, I mean, Australia is a signatory to pretty much every major sensible treaty in the world. But the problem is, once we've now married to the United States, we don't follow any of them. The United States has got this euphemistically called rules-based order,
Mhm.
which means whatever the US wants to do goes. They don't follow the treaties. And they just say things like, "Oh, that's national security." We are an exception. They paint the China threat as being bad, when actually China is surrounded by US bases, 750 or something, and it is the reverse of what the US says. But because they control our media,
Mhm.
they get away with it. And that is one of the problems. One of the biggest things is that we no longer have a choice about going to war with China. Now that the US Navy and the Australian Navy have effectively become one organisation.
Yes, since they are controlling the narrative, is Australia today caught in a US-China conflict? And will Australia be able to avert the repercussions of any American future war in the region? Or are the US actions putting Australia on a path to war with China in the same way that US actions did in Ukraine?
Only some Australians understand that the war in the Ukraine was actually provoked by the US. Unfortunately, the stranglehold on the media is very strong, and the majority of Australians apparently support arming and escalating the war in Ukraine. They mistakenly think that
Because they are controlling the narrative, David.
they control the narrative, completely control the narrative. And that's the dangerous thing. That's one of the reasons that surprised me, is why I'm a whistleblower. It's not so much about Afghanistan, although we need to learn some lessons from it. It's about the next war. And if we keep putting out false narratives, if we keep saying things which are not true, before we are knowing it, we'll be saying, the Chinese have committed some terrible atrocity in Taiwan. We need to save Taiwan, and everyone will buy it. And before we know it, we'll be in some terrible nuclear war, which the US want, because they are threatened by China, and they think that a war with China will disrupt China's rise, and it'll be good for US business. It probably will. Both of those things will be achieved. The problem is it will kill millions of people. It will be incredibly destructive. It'll be a bit like the war in Iraq, which killed maybe 1 million people. But was very good for the businesses of the people that make missiles and aeroplanes.
Yet, on the other hand, over 20 Australian Labor Party branches around Australia have now passed anti-AUKUS resolutions, and the list is growing by the day. Many of the branches are calling on the Albanese government to withdraw from the pact, while others want a parliamentary inquiry into the $368 billion deal. A new informal grassroots group called Labour Against War came also into action in this line. Can this internal backlash turn around such a paramount foreign policy in your perspective, David?
It will go close. I'm going to the Labor Party conference. I'm not a party member, but I'm going to speak outside it. And I am interested because this is how ridiculous the situation is. Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister, he protested against the war in Iraq. He's a left-wing Labor guy. He is meant to be a man of the people. He's meant to be all about workers' rights. Now, the people who are really going to suffer in another world war are going to be the workers. We voted an election overwhelmingly to change from this sort of neoliberal party, which was all about war and was all about America and all about whatever the Americans wanted, we'd give them twice over. We've changed that government because they were very corrupt and very unpopular. We put in a far more progressive socialist government, and yet we found out that their policies in relation to an incredibly dangerous war with China are exactly the same as the right-wing government. Now, it doesn't make sense. And a lot of Labor Party people are saying they want to leave the party. Now, we don't want them to leave the party, but we do want Anthony Albanese to justify it. What has he got to hide? Why doesn't he justify how a war will be good for working people in Australia? Because that's who he's meant to represent. That's what the Labor Party represents, workers' rights.
That's David, that's very interesting, since the last few years have seen the steady expansion of joint US-Australian military exercises, adding, of course, to the large and still growing Pine Gap facility likely to play a key role in any U.S. conventional or nuclear operations from Africa to the Pacific. In this sense, do Australians see China as a threat? The common Australians. What lies behind Australia's subservience to U.S. militarism? And is Australia on a path to war and confrontation with China?
We are on a path to war. There's no doubt about it. There will be war with China probably in 2 years unless the unions get to change Anthony Albanese's mind. I've seen it. I'm an insider. It's the same as Iraq. It's the same as Vietnam. They are looking for, and they got away with it. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it was a terrible dress rehearsal when, even though they provoked the US, provoked the war in Ukraine, they got away with it by demonizing Russia and saying it's all Russia's fault. Now, they spent 20 years creating Putin in the image of sort of Adolf Hitler and writing, I've seen it because it's a military operation. It called an information operation. They spend a long time doing the same with China. Now, you could write in the major papers in Australia, you could write that the Chinese have a farm where they're eating babies, and people would believe it. You can publish anything about China now. No one wants to know that actually China has eradicated poverty, for example, and that was their major goal. And while they might not be a perfect nation in many ways, their goal was to alleviate
Maybe
poverty.
they want to sabotage Australia's trade with China.
Yeah, so a lot of intelligent people have said that, and it seems quite obvious because they've said things like, people, insiders have said Australia is feeding the beast. I think John Mearsheimer, who is a sort of controversial but intelligent man, has said that the US can see that we are helping China overtake them. All the US cares about is being the number one nation. They're worried China might do it. They see Australia as enabling China. And so they have basically bought us out with a lot of clever. The US is clever, there's no doubt about it. And they control our narrative. They pay people to so-called experts. They managed to get something published in one of our normally most reputable papers saying basically we should be digging, everyone should be digging bomb shelters in the back of our gardens because the Chinese bombs will be coming any day, not 2 years, could be next week. Now, that was a US plan, but they managed to get away with it.
Sure. Yes. Now, Australia now allows unfettered access for American troops, ships and aircraft to Australian territory. Yet Aussie ministers keep talking about sovereignty. What does sovereignty actually mean here?
There is no such thing as sovereignty. There is, in many ways, it seems like an extremist thing to say, but there is no such country as Australia anymore in relation to foreign relations. For example, we went to war in Afghanistan the same day the US went to war in Afghanistan. We left the war in Afghanistan exactly the same day the US left the war in Afghanistan. We will go to war against Taiwan the same day the US declares it. We have no independent foreign policy with any country in the world. There isn't any difference between the US military and Australian military anymore. The two people from both services worked. Australian can be in the US forces and a US person can be in the Australian forces. There isn't really an independent Australian Defence Force anymore. And the problem with that is, what are we going to do if we ever have to fight America?
Right.
And that's not impossible. And they now, if a country no longer has an independent defense force, it's not really a country anymore.
Sure. Well, obviously, the US wants to contain China. This is the number one goal. So Australia has tangoed into the South China Sea, into the Quad, and into AUKUS with the same intention. Has Australia been made to fear the wrong wolf If there's a wolf at its door, is it terrorism or militarism or neither? Is it China? Is it the US? Or is it its own government, as some might argue, sir?
It's completely our own government. By far, the greatest danger to Australians is our own leaders. They are spineless. They will do anything for a free lunch. They have sold our country out. No doubt they think they're getting some benefit from it, probably as something as simple as a donation to their election campaign. But Australia has resources. We have a lot of very intelligent people. We have fantastic agriculture. We could actually stand on our own. We have nothing to fear from standing on our own. And that would actually make us strong. We're like a child who lives with their parent, and the parent, a bit like Rapunzel, we are the Rapunzel with a mother who says, you can't go outside, it's so dangerous. And
Exactly.
we believe it. We're silly enough to say, hang on, maybe this weird parent locking us up is the problem, and we need to get out there and see the world for ourselves, because China was our biggest trading partner. China hasn't invaded a country in quite a long time. The US,
In the last 70
unfortunately,
years, actually, they haven't launched any war. Yes.
I know, but the US, it's not quite
It's
so
a long
accurate.
list. It's a very long list of
Yeah,
wars.
we don't have time. We don't have time to list how many wars they have
Exactly.
started.
Yes. Now, David, you are charged with leaking confidential material to journalists about potential war crimes by Australian Special Forces soldiers in Afghanistan. And you want your court summons displayed in the Australian War Memorial. You are facing 50 years in prison for blowing the whistle on Australian forces' unethical, harmful, and highly politicized leadership, which fostered a culture of impunity in Afghanistan. Standing up for Australian values, David, came at a great personal cost. Tell us more.
That's right. I'm facing the rest of my life in prison, and the trial is coming up now. It'll be a jury trial. The government are determined to fight it, and there is a very good chance I will be convicted and spend the rest of my life in jail. But just talking to you, it reminds me that I am more convinced than ever that I am standing up for what is right. We have become completely politicized. We have lost our way as a nation. We no longer have a moral compass. We do whatever the US says, and I've had enough of it. And a lot of people have as well. Now, if they put me in jail, it will be the best thing I've ever done in my life. I will go to there with my head held up high. I've got 2 teenage children, 2 teenage daughters who I love very much. And it will be very, very hard for them. But there is no better example that I can give them than standing up for what is right at whatever the cost, and setting an example to future generations of Australians to say, this is how we behave in the face of wrongdoing, of bullying, and we never kneel down to people who will give away Australian sovereignty.
Excellent, David McBride, Australian war crimes whistleblower. Thank you very much for standing up for justice, for what is right, and sharing your views. Always a pleasure to have you, David.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be on your show again.
It's our honor, sir. Thank you. لعل البروفيسور جيفري ساكس مدير شبكة حلول التنمية المستدامة التابعة للأمم المتحدة قال في ندوة عقدت مؤخرا في مدينة ملبورن: لقد جرى التخطيط لتدهور العلاقات بين الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية والصين. منذ تأسيسها اتبعت أمريكا باستمرار استراتيجية كبرى تركز على الحصول والحفاظ على القوة المتفوقة على مختلف المنافسين، أولاً في قارة أمريكا الشمالية، ثم في نصف الكرة الغربي، وأخيراً على مستوى العالم. لقد قادتنا خطة توسيع الناتو مباشرة إلى حرب أوكرانيا، والتي هي بالفعل حرب أمريكية روسية بالوكالة حول توسع الناتو الذي بات يفتح مكاتب في شرق آسيا، وهي منطقة ليست بالضبط شمال الأطلسي. واليوم هذه التصرفات الأمريكية تضعنا على طريق الحرب مع الصين بالطريقة نفسها، بيد أن حرب آسيا والمحيط الهادئ ستكون كارثية أكثر. الصين لا تمثل تهديداً لأستراليا، والصين لا تمثل تهديداً للعالم. من المقلق أن القيادة الأمنية غير المستقرة والشديدة التوتر في الولايات المتحدة تهدف إلى أن تكون الرقم واحداً، وما زالت تقتات على مجد الإمبراطورية العالمية، ولكن ألا ينبغي لها أن تقلع عن تأجيج لهيب حرب خاسرة؟ من كل الميادين سلاما وتحية، في مان الله.